The air upon the command dais of the Song of Oblivion was not air at all. It was a vacuum sterile and absolute resonant only with the silent thrum of technologies that defied the laws of physics. At its heart, upon a throne of obsidian necrodermis that seemed to drink the light of captured stars, sat Zarek the Silent King. Before him, the galaxy burned. It was not a literal fire, but a sprawling holographic representation of the Milky Way, a tapestry of searing conflict and raw, chaotic energy. Supernovas bloomed like fleeting, violent flowers. Warp storms curdled reality into shades of madness. Green tides of orcs smashed against the disciplined formations of the Imperium of Man, and tendrils of a great shadow, a hunger from beyond the void, crept ever inward from the galactic rim. To another, it would be a sight of glorious conquest or terrifying anarchy. To Zarek, it was the view of a gardener gazing upon a garden he had personally meticulously poisoned 60 million years ago. Every star system screaming in the throes of war, every civilization rising only to fall to ruin, every flicker of life born only to be extinguished. They were all weeds growing rampant in the fertile soil of a decision made in utter desperation. He was the architect of this suffering, the progenitor of this long, agonizing age. His gaze was not one of pride or malice. It was an impossibly ancient, impossibly heavy weight of observation. His metallic fingers, articulated with a precision that could recalibrate a star's core, rested upon the arm of his throne. He did not feel the cold of the living metal, just as he did not feel joy or sorrow or fury. He only processed data, the telemetry of loss, the calculus of regret, 60 million years. A span of time that rendered the rise and fall of humanity a mere flicker, a footnote in the grand silent saga of his failure. He remembered. Oh, his memory engrams were perfect, flawless. He remembered the sting of his world's cruel radioactive sun upon his flesh. He remembered the scent of ozone before a battle, the taste of bitter wine at a council of kings, the sound of lamentation that was the constant defining anthem of his people, the Necrontyr. He remembered the feeling of a soul. That was the crux of it. The great bargain. Immortality in exchange for essence. Unity in exchange for self. He had seen his people, the Necrontyr, fractured by rebellion and consumed by their own short, cancer-riddled lives. He had seen their terror of mortality, an obsession that dwarfed all other ambitions. And so he had sought a cure. He had found not a cure, but an amputation. His gaze shifted from the swirling chaos of the galactic map to his own reflection faintly captured on the polished floor of the dais. He saw not the face of Zarek, the last silent king of the Necrontyr, but the impassive death mask of the Necron. A gleaming skull of silvered necrodermis eyes glowing with the cold green light of a machine's logic. There was no pain in this form, no fear, no despair. There was only the hollow echo of what had once been. A ghost in a perfect, eternal machine. The silence in his mind was no longer a peace he had sought in the void between galaxies. During his long, self-imposed exile, he had watched this galaxy evolve. He had seen the Eldari Empire rise to impossible heights of psychic majesty, only to collapse into degeneracy and horror. He had seen humanity crawl from the dust of their homeworld, reach for the stars with arrogant ambition, and build an empire of faith and ignorance. He had watched them all, deeming them ephemeral, unworthy of his attention. They were the background radiation of a universe he had abandoned. But something had changed. Something had called him back from the silent abyss. Not a threat to the Necron race's existence, for in their current form they could outlast stars. Not a desire to reclaim his throne, for his power was already absolute among those who answered his call. It was a threat to his regret. A threat to the final, desperate hope he had nurtured in the cold data streams of his mind for 60 million years. a purpose that had crystallized in the face of a horror that threatened to consume the very building blocks of his penance. The galaxy was not his to conquer. It was his to cultivate, to prune, to silence. He needed the lesser races, these transient sparks of life, for his great work. He needed their biological information, the chaotic, messy, vibrant essence they called a soul, the very thing he had bargained away. For his return was not about dominion. It was about reclamation. A project so audacious it bordered on cosmic blasphemy to undo the devil's bargain, to reverse the biotransference, to give his people back the souls he had stolen from them. And as he watched the galaxy burn, Sharek, the last king of a dead people, felt the closest a machine could come to a shudder. The path to redemption was not paved with mercy or forgiveness. It would be paved with the silent, ordered extinction of trillions, a final, terrible act of galactic gardening to cleanse the soil before a new seed could be planted. A new dawn for the Necrontier built upon the total twilight of all others. The ultimate question, the one that had echoed in his silent eternity, remained: could a soul once devoured by a star god ever truly be reclaimed? Or was this merely the final, grandest delusion of a king who had already lost everything? Long before the silence, there was only pain. The home of the Necronter was a world of magnificent brutalist cities that clawed at a sky perpetually veiled in radiation haze. Their star, a bloated and malevolent giant, was not a source of life, but a relentless executioner. It bathed their planet in torrents of ionic winds and solar flares that gnawed at the very essence of the living cell. Every dawn was a sentence, every noon an affliction. Life for the Necrontyr was a brief, painful pilgrimage to the tomb. Their bodies were frail vessels prone to cancerous growths and rapid decay. To live past the third decade was a rarity, a mark of fortune that was celebrated with solemn, fearful rites. Their society, for all its technological genius, was a culture built in the shadow of the mausoleum. They had mastered atomic fission, gravitational engineering, and the cold logic of cosmic law, yet they could not mend the fatal flaw in their own biology. A procession moved through the funereal avenues of the capital. Towering monuments to long-dead kings stared down with empty eyes, their stone forms more enduring than the flesh and blood dynasties they represented. The air, thick with filtered incense, and the hum of anti-gravitic pallbearers carried the weight of 1 billion similar processions. At the head of the column walked a young king, his face a mask of composed grief, though his heart was a knot of cold fury. This was Sharek, yet to be the silent king, still a being of flesh, blood, and failing genes. The sarcophagus that floated before him contained the remains of his own father. Another monarch claimed not by war or intrigue, but by the slow, inexorable rot that was their shared inheritance. Their temples were not places of worship, but laboratories of preservation. Their priests were not spiritual guides, but masters of mortuary science, endlessly seeking new ways to prolong the inevitable. Their art was the art of the tomb, intricate carvings on sarcophagi, mournful dirges that echoed in vast necropolises, statues not of life and vibrancy, but of stoic, resigned decay. They were a people haunted by their own ghosts before they had even died, their every achievement soured by the bitter certainty of its impermanence. The desire for immortality was not an ambition. It was a desperate, all-consuming scream against a hostile universe. Later in the high chamber of the Triarch, the simmering rage within Zarek found its focus. He was now Pharaon of the Zarakan dynasty, and by right of succession a voice in the ruling council of their fractured empire. Before him stood the other two pillars of their government, the stoic and traditionalist Phaeron of the Sautek, and the pragmatic but cautious Phaeron of the Neocon. Holographic signals flickered around them, bearing ill tidings from the outer territories. The Maynarch dynasty, ever brutal, had begun raiding their neighbors for biological resources. The Ogdebek, ever isolationist, threatened secession over tithes they deemed excessive. The unity of the Necrontyr was a fragile lie, a crumbling facade held together by ancient pacts that were losing their meaning with every funeral procession. The Monarch must be punished. The Sautek Pharaon declared, his voice a low growl. We will send our legions and remind them of their oaths, and create a civil war that will bleed us dry while our sun continues to cook us alive, countered the Neocon Pharaon. We must negotiate. Offer them concessions. Their people are suffering as much as any. Sharek listened, his gaze fixed on the star chart that dominated the chamber. He saw the Sautek's pride and the Neocon's pragmatism as two sides of the same weakness. They were looking inward, squabbling over the dwindling scraps of a dying race. They sought to mend the cracks in a shattered vessel, blind to the fact that the vessel itself was fundamentally flawed. His people were turning on each other, their desperation curdling into resentment and rebellion. The true enemy wasn't a rival dynasty, it was the despair that fueled their division. He knew then with the cold certainty of a mathematician solving an equation that his people could not be saved from themselves. They could not be reasoned with or intimidated into unity. They needed to be forged into one. And for that, they needed a crucible. They needed an anvil. They needed an enemy so vast, so powerful, so utterly alien that the petty squabbles between dynasties would seem like the games of children. An enemy that would force them to look up from their own open graves and face a threat to their very existence. His eyes traced the shimmering lines of cosmic territory past their own blighted star and settled upon the serene, sprawling dominion of the galactic masters. The Old Ones, beings of incomprehensible longevity, masters of the warp, creators of countless life forms. They who lived for millions of years were an insult to the Necrontyr's brief, painful existence. A terrible, brilliant, and utterly blasphemous idea began to form in Sarek's ambitious mind. He would not just unite his people. He would give them a cause worthy of their technological might. He would give them a target for their collective rage, a focus for their fear of death. He would steer the Necrontyr away from the slow suicide of civil war and point them like a loaded gun at the heart of heaven itself. He would give them an enemy. He would give them a war. Sharek's gambit was a staggering success. His declaration of war, delivered before the assembled Pharaons of all dynasties, was a masterwork of political theater. He spoke not of unity through fear, but of righteous justice. He painted the Old Ones as galactic tyrants, hoarding the secrets of immortality, while lesser races like their own were left to suffer and die. He spoke of their birthright to permanence, a right denied to them by these aloof, silent gods. He transformed the Necrontyr's cosmic despair into a burning, focused rage. For the first time in millennia, the Necrontyr Empire was truly united. Legions that had once stood ready to tear each other apart now stood as one, their cold eyes turned toward the stars. The opening salvo of the war in heaven was a spectacle of terrifying power. Necrontyr fleets comprised of crescent-winged tomb ships and pyramidal dirge-class raiders tore through the fabric of reality with their dolmen gates. Their weapons were instruments of physical law, perfected to a murderous degree. Gauss cannons fired arcs of emerald lightning that stripped targets atom from atom, leaving nothing but drifting motes of dust. Living metal hulls wounded by enemy fire flowed back together, as if the damage had been a mere illusion. Their strategies were flawless, executed with the passionless logic of a thinking machine. They were the masters of the material universe, and they had come to claim their due. They were met with a power they could not comprehend. The Old Ones did not fight like the Necrontyr. They did not merely command fleets or deploy armies. They wielded creation itself as a weapon. In the void, Necrontyr ships that were impervious to any physical shell were suddenly swarmed by ethereal predators born from raw psychic energy. Captains on their command bridges went mad, their consciousnesses shredded by telepathic screams that echoed across the stars. Black holes were born in the heart of Necrontyr formations. Stars were made to go nova, consuming entire Necron-tier fleets in their cleansing fire. The Necron-tier fought a war of physics. The Old Ones fought a war of reality, and reality was their servant. And they did not fight alone. From the jewel-like craft worlds of the Eldari came warriors of impossible grace and deadly power. They moved like dancers through the battlefield, their shuriken catapults spitting monomolecular blades, their wraithbone constructs animated by the souls of their dead and singing with psychic force. They were everything the Necron-tier were not: vibrant, passionate, and intrinsically linked to the Empyrean, the great ocean of psychic energy that the Necron-tier with their soulless dispositions could never touch. They were the perfect counter-scalpel of psychic energy against the Necron-tier's hammer of cold metal. If the Eldari were a scalpel, the Krork were a sledgehammer. Unleashed by their masters, this green-skinned race was a biological plague of unending violence. Hulking, brutish, and impossibly resilient, they swarmed across worlds the Necron-tier had conquered. Their technology was crude, often looking like it was bolted together from scrap, yet it functioned with devastating effect, powered by the Krork's own latent psychic gestalt. For every Krork that fell, two more seemed to take its place, their roars of "War," a primal biological cry that stood in stark opposition to the silent, ordered legions of the Necrons. The war became a litany of failures. The Necron-tier's mastery of the material plane meant nothing. Their legions could annihilate a world only to find themselves fighting the ghosts of its defenders in the next system. Their unbreachable fortresses were bypassed by armies that traveled through the warp. Their flawless logic was shattered by the sheer unpredictable chaos of their enemies. From the command throne of his flagship, Zarek watched the unity he had forged become a shared experience of utter annihilation. His people were being exterminated. The tomb worlds they had spent centuries building were being cracked open, their slumbering populace slaughtered before they could even be activated. The war to save his people from a slow death by radiation had become a fast, brutal, and humiliating path to extinction. The desperation he had sought to channel had returned magnified 1,000-fold by the dawning, terrifying realization that they had picked a fight with the fundamental forces of the universe itself. And they were losing, utterly and completely. Defeat had become a certainty. In the silent strategium of his warship, Zarek watched the last symbols of his grand fleets flicker and die on the holographic display. The war in heaven was lost. The Necron-tier empire, the greatest civilization the material universe had ever produced, was being systematically dismantled. Its worlds burned, its people hunted to the edge of oblivion. The unity he had forged was now the shackle that bound them together on their path to the gallows. Despair was a tangible presence in the chamber, colder and more absolute than the void between stars. It was then that the stars began to speak. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling. A distortion in the cosmic background radiation, a flicker of impossible energy readings from their own cursed sun. Cryptechs monitoring the star reported anomalies that defied physics. The star's raging energies were coalescing, taking on forms that were not random, but intelligent. Ancient, malevolent, and utterly vast intelligences. They were the Satan, the star gods. They did not send emissaries. They simply appeared, their forms striding across the corona of the sun like gods of myth. One was a being of liquid metal and mocking light, Mephetran the Deceiver, whose voice slid into the minds of the Necron-tier, not as sound but as irresistible logic. Another was a figure of absolute blackness, a hole in the shape of a skeleton that radiated a chilling finality, Azagorod the Nightbringer. They radiated a shared primal hatred for the Old Ones and all their living creations. Their offer was simple, delivered directly into the consciousness of Zarek and his council. We are the universe's true masters. The Old Ones are usurpers. Their children, the living, are a chaotic plague. We offer you a weapon against them. We offer you victory. We offer you the immortality you crave. Your command of living metal is impressive. Give us bodies of this necrodermis physical vessels to house our energy, and we will share our power. You will become our chosen soldiers in the war to reclaim reality. You will be eternal. You will be unified. You will be victorious. The offer hung in the silent chamber, a promise of salvation that felt like a venomous serpent coiling around a drowning man. It was everything they had ever wanted, a cure for their mortality and a weapon to win their unwinnable war. Sharek convened the Triarch one last time. He laid out the Citan's proposal, the promise of metal bodies immune to radiation and time, the promise of power to finally crush the Eldari and the Krork. Most of the council, beaten and desperate, saw only salvation. But one voice rose in protest. Orikan, an aged cryptech whose mastery of chronomancy allowed him to see the branching paths of probability, bowed low before the king. "My king, I have seen the echoes of this future," Orikan rasped, his voice trembling. "This is a pact of damnation. The Citan do not speak of life but of stasis. They do not offer to save our spirit but to encase it in a cage of eternal silence. The price they ask is not our loyalty, but our very essence. I beg you, choose extinction over this damnation." Sharek looked from the trembling cryptech to the faces of his other Firons' faces, etched with the ravages of radiation, haunted by the specter of defeat. He remembered his father's slow decay. He saw the trillions of his people facing a meaningless end. Orikan offered them an honorable death. The Citan offered a merciless victory. In his pride, in his absolute refusal to let his people fade into a forgotten footnote of history, Sharek made his choice. He believed he could control the outcome, that he could use the Citan as they intended to use him. "We have lived with the curse of flesh for too long," Sharek declared, his voice ringing with grim finality. "Honor is a luxury for those who are not facing annihilation. We will not die. We will endure. We accept the gift of the star gods." The biotransference was not a process of creation, but of industrial slaughter. On every Necron tier world, under the guidance of the Citan, colossal biofurnaces were erected. They were not forges of metal, but cathedrals of extermination, glowing with an energy that was neither physical nor psychic, but something far older and more terrible. The command was given. Billions of Necrontyre, from the lowest citizen to the highest noble, marched in silent, ordered columns towards the light. They were told this was their ascension, the final victory over the flesh that had betrayed them. They walked past their grand tombs, now rendered obsolete, and into the waiting maws of the furnaces. The moment of transformation was an agony beyond description. Flesh was not merely burned, it was unwritten from reality in a flash of green light. Consciousness, the delicate, intricate pattern of thought and memory, was violently ripped from its biological anchor. For a single terrifying instant, each Necron tier was a disembodied ghost screaming in a void. Then came the transfer, the pouring of their minds into cold, waiting bodies of living necrodermis. And in that moment of transition, the true price was paid. As their new bodies activated, a new sensation overwhelmed them, a horrific spiritual hunger. The Citan, now housed in their own grand necrodermis forms, feasted. They drank the souls of the Necron tier, the vibrant, chaotic energy of life, the essence of self, the spark of free will. It was all siphoned away, a spiritual banquet of unimaginable scale. The psychic scream of 1,000,000,000,000 souls being devoured echoed in the void, unheard by any, save the old ones who recoiled in horror, and Sharek himself. He too underwent the process, his royal form the most advanced of all. He emerged perfect, immortal, powerful, and utterly hollow. As his green optic lenses flared to life, he saw what he had done. He saw his legions no longer an army of individuals, but a silent tide of automatons, their heads bowed in perfect, mindless obedience. He felt the vast, silent emptiness where the vibrant life of his people had once been. The Citan, drunk with power, laughed in his mind. He had won. He had saved his people from death. But standing there in the silent graveyard of a billion souls, Zarek knew with chilling certainty that he had just committed the greatest act of genocide in the history of the cosmos. His regret and emotion he was no longer meant to feel began its 60-million-year vigil. With the souls of 1 trillion Necronta fueling them, the C'tan were invincible. With the C'tan empowering their legions, the Necrons were inevitable. The war in heaven, once a desperate struggle for survival, became a relentless campaign of galactic extermination. The Old Ones, masters of reality, were broken, scattered and hunted down. Their final desperate creations, the vibrant Aeldari and the brutish Krork, were left to fight over the ashes of a ruined galaxy. The Necrons were victorious. They stood as the silent, undisputed masters of a graveyard that stretched from one end of the Milky Way to the other. It was a hollow, silent victory. There were no parades, no songs of triumph. There was only the hum of reality-warping engines and the sight of the C'tan now clad in vast bodies of living metal, striding across conquered worlds like arrogant gods. They had grown drunk on their power, their cosmic egos, now a greater threat to the fabric of reality than the Old Ones had ever been. They began to turn on each other in petty celestial squabbles, unleashing energies that could unmake stars as a mere side effect of their divine tantrums. They saw the Necrons not as allies, but as property, their eternal silent slaves. They had underestimated the depth of the Silent King's cold fury. Zarek had not forgotten the psychic death scream of his people. He had not forgiven the theft of their souls. His obedience had been a mask, his servitude a means to an end. While the C'tan had been focused on defeating the Old Ones, Zarek's finest cryptex had been secretly crafting the ultimate weapons. Not weapons of conquest, but god-slaying engines that drew upon the most esoteric and forbidden principles of physics. The betrayal was executed with the silent, flawless precision of a machine. At a designated moment across the entire Necron Empire, the rebellion began. The C'tan in their hubris were caught completely unaware. The very legions they saw as slaves turned their Gauss cannons upon them. The grand celestial orreries they used to channel cosmic power were turned into focusing lenses for weapons of impossible scale. The star gods, for the first time, knew fear. They could not be killed. They were as fundamental to reality as gravity or light. But they could be broken. Zarek unleashed the ultimate fruit of his vengeance, a network of celestial structures that resonated at the precise frequency of the C'tan's energy signatures. Across the galaxy, the star gods screamed as their unified divine consciousnesses were shattered. They were split, fractured into millions of insane, raging shards, each retaining a sliver of their original power, but none of their coherence. Zarek the Silent King had taken gods and turned them into tools. He ordered the shards to be gathered and bound within Tesseract labyrinths to be used as eternal screaming power sources for the empire they had sought to rule. Vengeance was complete, but the galaxy was still a ruin, infested with the scattered feral children of the Old Ones. Zarek, looking upon his silent legions, knew they could not rule this chaotic new era. So he issued his last command as sovereign of the Necron Empire. They would enter the Great Sleep. Their tomb cities would seal themselves beneath the surfaces of 1,000,000 worlds. Their armies would deactivate in their stasis crypts. They would wait for 60 million years, a sleep so profound that the galaxy would forget them. They would wait for the lesser races to rise and fall, to cleanse the galaxy of their chaotic energies, preparing it for the Necrons' inevitable return to an ordered, silent domain. As the command was broadcast, Zarek performed his first truest act of penance. Within the command core of his throne, he accessed the control protocols that made him the Silent King, the unbreakable command codes that gave him absolute direct control over the will of every Necron. With a final silent command, he erased them. He severed the chains of command, restoring a ghost of the free will he had bargained away. When they awoke, they would be lords of their own shattered minds, not his puppets. Then he turned his back on his silent, sleeping empire. He boarded his personal vessel, the Song of Oblivion, and set a course for the absolute darkness of the intergalactic void. He began his long, lonely exile, a king without a people, a machine burdened with a soul's worth of regret, seeking a path to redemption in the silent, empty spaces between the galaxies. The Milky Way shrank behind the Song of Oblivion, its swirling arms of stellar fire coalescing into a single, magnificent jewel suspended in the dark. It was a masterpiece of creation, and Zarek, its self-appointed curator, had abandoned it to rot. His course was set for the great empty, the silent, starless abyss that separated the galaxies. There were no solar winds here, no nebulae, no gravitational tides. There was only the perfect, cold, absolute silence he had craved and cursed in equal measure. This void was to be his monastery and his laboratory for the next 60 million years. His exile was not an act of idle remorse. It was a focused, relentless quest for absolution through science. In the sterile databanks of his flagship, he endlessly replayed the moments of the biotransference. He analyzed the energy signatures of the Citan as they feasted. He dissected the very concept of a soul, not as a philosopher, but as a physicist. He theorized it to be a form of quantum-entangled bioenergy, a chaotic but vital force that his people had traded for the cold logic of the machine. His sin was unforgivable, but perhaps with enough time and knowledge it was not irreversible. Millennia bled into one another. He directed his ship to the edge of other galaxies' vast island universes of alien life. He did not enter them. He was an observer, not a conqueror. He dispatched long-range probes that gathered data on 1,000 different evolutionary paths. He studied silicon-based life forms that built crystalline cities on tidally locked worlds, gaseous beings that swam in the atmospheres of supergiants, and primitive organic sludge just beginning its crawl from the oceans. He collected, collated, and analyzed. He was searching for a pattern, a biological key, a species that might hold the secret to housing a consciousness without the fatal flaws of the Necron tire's original flesh. His repentance was a long, cold, and meticulous research project. All the while, his most powerful senses remained fixed upon his home. He watched with the detachment of a historian reading a scroll as the legacy of the old ones tore itself apart. He saw the Aeldari Empire, a civilization of psychic artisans, reach its incandescent peak, and he watched its fall, a cataclysm of arrogance and decadence that tore a hole in reality itself. The birth of their dark god Slanesh and the creation of the Eye of Terror was to Zarek's logical mind a predictable outcome. It was the endpoint of a species that had allowed emotion and chaos to rule over order and discipline. He felt no sympathy, only a cold confirmation that life left to its own devices would inevitably consume itself. He watched the once mighty Krork, the perfect biological warriors, devolve over millions of years. Their technological prowess decayed, their strategic genius curdled into simple, brutish cunning. They became the Orcs, a self-perpetuating galactic plague. Another failed experiment of his ancient enemies. Then came humanity. He observed their slow crawl from primordial ooze, their brief and brilliant age of technological discovery, their catastrophic fall into barbarism during the age of strife. He witnessed the rise of their emperor, a being of immense psychic power, and the great bloody crusade that followed. He saw their civil war, a conflict born of hubris and betrayal that dwarfed even the schisms of the old Necron dynasties. He watched them build their imperium, an empire founded on ignorant superstition and the worship of a corpse on a golden throne. He studied them with a biologist's curiosity. Their adaptability was impressive. Their sheer fecundity was a strategic asset. But they were flawed, brittle, short-lived, utterly dependent on the chaotic energies of the warp for travel and communication. To Zarek, the Imperium of Man was just another wave larger than most, but still just a wave destined to break and recede upon the shores of time. They were not a threat. They were not a concern. They were merely the latest weeds to grow in his poisoned garden, and like all the others, they would eventually wither and die. He had all of eternity. The galaxy and its transient inhabitants could wait. For an age, the routine was unbroken. Data flowed was analyzed and was archived. The universe outside the Song of Oblivion was a predictable, if chaotic, system. But 60 million years of exile had not prepared Zarek for the anomaly. It came not as a warning, but as an absence, a void within the void. One of his long-range stellar observatories tasked with monitoring the light from a galaxy cluster, millions of light-years away, began reporting corrupted data. It was not a malfunction. The data was perfect, perfectly blank. A shadow vast and impossibly deep was falling across the sensor array, eclipsing the light of entire galaxies. Zarek diverted more processing power, focusing his instruments on the phenomenon. The scale was illogical. The shadow stretched for thousands of light-years, a moving patch of utter blackness. It was not a dust cloud, for it absorbed all radiation with perfect efficiency. It was not a gravitational anomaly, for it did not warp space-time in any predictable way. And most unsettling of all, it cast a shadow in the warp. Where this entity passed, the turbulent sea of the Empyrean grew still and dead. It was a silence even greater than the one inside Zarek's own mind, a silence of absolute hunger. Its trajectory was unmistakable. It was not drifting. It was moving with the slow, inexorable purpose of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. It was heading for the Milky Way. Curiosity, the ghost of an emotion he no longer possessed, compelled him. He was the silent king. He did not flee from the unknown. He commanded the Song of Oblivion to alter its course not away from the shadow, but towards its leading edge. He would intercept this mystery and dissect it. He met the Vanguard generations later. They were not ships, not in any sense he understood. They were creatures, organisms of chitinous plating, writhing tentacles, and membranous solar sails gliding silently through the void. They were life-engineered and perfected for the single purpose of interstellar predation. Zarek dispatched a flight of swift Tomb-Blade scout craft, their twin Gauss blasters inert. His purpose was analysis, not combat. The response was immediate and terrifyingly efficient. The bioships did not fire weapons, they birthed them. Spores were launched that blossomed into swarms of smaller organisms which propelled themselves towards his craft. Boarding torpedoes of sinew and bone, tipped with diamond-hard claws, slammed into the necrodermis hulls of his machines. From within them spilled creatures of nightmare, armed with bioacid and scything talons. They did not just attack his machines, they tried to eat them, their jaws scraping uselessly against the living metal, seeking to analyze, to understand, to consume. Zarek activated the Tomb-Blade's weapons. Emerald lances of Gauss fire flayed the creatures apart, atom by atom. But the swarm learned. The next wave of warriors they spawned had carapaces that shimmered with a deflective energy field. He switched to high-intensity particle beams. The wave after that had ablative hides that dispersed the heat. It was evolution on a timescale of seconds. He was not fighting an army. He was fighting a single hyper-intelligent metabolism. He sacrificed the scout wing, pulling the Song of Oblivion back into the darkness, its databanks now filled with priceless, horrifying information. He analyzed the creature's genetic makeup, its methods of procreation, the silent, overwhelming psychic network that bound every organism into a single, unified consciousness, the hive mind. And then he ran the final simulation, the one that extrapolated its purpose, its diet, its ultimate goal. In that moment of cold, logical calculation, Zarek understood a truth more terrible than the chaos of the Old Ones or the soul-devouring evil of the Citan. The Khitan had been parasites. They needed the Necrontyr to exist. The races of the galaxy fought for land, for faith, for power. They killed, they conquered, they destroyed. But they always left something behind. This entity, this great devourer, did not conquer. It consumed. The simulation on his holographic display was stark. A Tyranid hive fleet arrives in a star system. It devours the defenders. Then it devours the civilians. Then it devours the fauna, the flora, the fish in the seas. It drinks the oceans dry and inhales the atmosphere. It strips every last scrap of biological matter from the world until all that remains is a dead, airless rock, which it then cracks open to feast upon the mineral-rich core. It leaves nothing behind, and suddenly the 60-million-year game had changed. His great work, the ultimate objective that had driven his long penance, the reversal of the biotransference, depended entirely on the availability of a suitable biological host. He needed the raw materials of life. He needed the Eldari or humanity or some other species with the correct genetic and spiritual potential to serve as the vessel for his people's consciousness. He had viewed them as weeds in his garden to be studied and eventually cultivated or culled at his leisure. He had been wrong. They were not weeds. They were a finite, irreplaceable resource, and the locusts were coming. If the Tyranids won, if their shadow fell across the entire Milky Way, there would be no hosts. There would be no biomass. There would be nothing but dead worlds and silent stars. His quest for redemption would be over. The damnation of his people would be sealed for all eternity. Their minds trapped in silent metal bodies until the stars themselves grew cold and died. This was not a threat to the living races of the galaxy. It was a direct threat to his hope. The Tyranids were the ultimate biological refutation of his entire plan. They would devour the key to his absolution. For the first time in an age, the cold logic of the Machine King gave way to something else, a flicker of something ancient, the protective instinct of a shepherd whose flock is about to be eaten. He looked at the holographic display of the Milky Way, no longer with the detachment of an exile, but with the cold, calculating eye of a returning king. Those flawed, chaotic, ephemeral life forms were no longer beneath his notice. They were now the most precious resource in the universe. And he would be damned to the void for a second time before he let the great devourer take them from him. He turned the Song of Oblivion around. His long sleep was over. The king was coming home. The journey back across the intergalactic void was a silent, purposeful rush. The Song of Oblivion, now at the head of a small, impossibly advanced flotilla that had served as his royal escort in exile, crossed the galactic rim like a phantom. The galaxy's outer edges were no longer the serene domain of the old ones, but a patchwork of petty empires and barbarian territories. His arrival did not go unnoticed, but the notice was fleeting. A long-range listening post of the Tor Empire detected his fleet's entry, logging it as a bizarre energy signature for a mere 18 seconds before the post and the asteroid it was built on were unwritten from time by a temporal weapon. A patrol of Imperial frigates, bold and ignorant, moved to intercept their voxcasters demanding identification. Their ships, their crews, and their defiant broadcast were simultaneously de-atomized by a focused beam of Gauss energy from 100,000 kilometers away. Jarek did not have time for the galaxy's new inhabitants. They were not his concern. They were obstacles momentarily inconvenient to be brushed aside with contemptuous ease. He ignored the blazing heart of the galaxy, the war-torn sectors of Ultramar and Kodia, and steered his fleet towards a quiet, forgotten quadrant. He was not here to announce his return to the lesser races. He was here to awaken his own. His destination was a single, apparently dead world orbiting a dying star Mandragora, a jewel of his own Sarachan dynasty, and a primary node in the ancient Necron power grid. From the silent bridge of his flagship, Jarek gazed upon the world. To a human surveyor, it was a worthless ball of rock and dust. To his senses, it was a fortress sleeping beneath a blanket of 60 million years. He did not need to land. He did not need to send an envoy. He simply opened a channel and broadcast. It was not a message of words. It was a complex symphony of command protocols and royal ciphers, a master key of such antiquity and authority that it could only have one source. It was the voice of the king, a voice the galaxy had not heard since before the Eldari were a spacefaring race. For a long moment, Mandragora remained silent. Then deep within the planet's core, something answered. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the crust. From orbit, Zarek watched as vast geometric lines of emerald light pulsed to life across the continents, tracing the circuits of a machine the size of a world. A mountain range miles high and hundreds of miles long began to retract, with the grinding slowness of ages revealing a dark, cavernous opening into the planet's heart. Deep within the necropolis, the master chronometer received the king's signal. It triggered the reanimation protocols. In the highest chambers of the royal court, stasis crypts hissed open. Necron overlords, their necrodermis bodies untouched by the passage of time, began to stir. Their dormant processors flickered to life, flooded with a single system-shocking datum execute command protocol. Alpha 1, the Silent King, has returned. Sharek did not wait for an invitation. An arc of translocation energy enveloped him, and he vanished from the bridge of his ship. He rematerialized in the center of the throne room of Mandragora. The air was thick with the dust of ages. Ancient standards bearing the glyph of his dynasty crumbled at his presence. Around him, the nobles of the court were in the process of awakening. A dozen overlords, the absolute rulers of this world, were slowly rising from their thrones of state, their optic lights glowing a dull, confused green. They stared at the figure who had appeared in their midst, a Necron of unparalleled artifice, taller, more regal, his very presence radiating an authority that was not programmed, but innate. There was a moment of profound silence, broken only by the creak of ancient metallic joints. Then, one by one, the overlords of Mandragora did something they had not done in 60 million years. They knelt, not with the quick obedience of an automaton, but with the slow, grinding reverence of a forgotten faith being rekindled. Metal scraped on stone as they lowered themselves before their returned monarch and god. The king was home. His first legion was his own. With Mandragora as his anchor, Sharek began the great work of awakening his empire. He sent out fleets bearing his royal ciphers, broadcasting the signal of his return to the dormant tomb, worlds of 100 dynasties. He expected to hear the crisp, logical reports of overlords waking their legions in perfect order. He expected a silent, efficient, and immediate consolidation of power. What he received was the sound of a dynasty screaming. His first attempt to contact the nearby tomb world of Valgul was met with a garbled transmission, a string of corrupted data interspersed with what sounded like the shrieking of tortured metal. Zarek dispatched a cohort of his elite Lich Guard to investigate. They found the great gates of Valgul torn from their hinges. The silent, ordered corridors were a charnel house littered with the dismembered bodies of Necron warriors. The attackers were not an alien race. They were the Necrons of Valgul themselves. From a secure observation vessel, Sharek watched the horror unfold on his view screen. He saw them. Hunched, twitching figures that moved with a predatory speed. Their metallic forms were draped in ragged strips of flayed skin and dripping flesh, grisly trophies taken from some organic prey. Their fingers had elongated into razor-sharp talons, and their faces were frozen in a silent, unending shriek. This was the Flayer's curse, the final spiteful revenge of a Satan he had shattered eons ago. It was not a physical ailment, but a virus of the mind. A digital madness that infected a Necron's core programming, convincing them they were still flesh and that they were starving. They were driven by an insatiable phantom hunger for the life they had lost, a hunger that had turned them into ghoulish cannibals. Disturbed, Sharek turned his attention to the great martial dynasties, the iron backbone of his old empire. He sent his awakening call to the formidable world of Diumnak. The response he received was not a pledge of fealty, but a cold, nihilistic declaration. Life is a Geltich in the grand design. Existence is a flaw. We are the correction. All must be returned to the great silence. He had awoken the destroyer cult. He confronted one of their lords via hololith, a being who had grotesquely modified its own body, replacing its legs with a hovering repulsor engine and its arms with massive annihilation cannons. There was no trace of the noble it had once been. There was only cold, hard purpose in its glowing red eyes. "Your return is irrelevant, Silent King," the Destroyer Lord stated, its voice devoid of all inflection. "Your goal to rebuild is a flawed premise. An empire is a monument to life, and life is disorder. We will cleanse this galaxy of its biological filth. Then we will cleanse our own race of the flawed memory of life. And when all is silent and perfect dust, we will turn our weapons upon ourselves. Only in absolute non-existence can our penance be complete." Zarek realized he was not speaking to a soldier, but to a priest of a new, terrible religion, where death was God and oblivion was salvation. His attempts to rally the more stable dynasties proved just as challenging. The Great Sleep had not been kind to the minds of the Necron nobility. 60 million years of silent conscious thought had eroded them in strange and unpredictable ways. When he contacted Solemnus, its master Trazyn the Infinite responded with infuriating politeness. He congratulated the Silent King on his return before immediately trying to bargain for a rare artifact Trazyn had spotted on one of Sharek's escort ships. The fate of the galaxy was secondary to the acquisition of a new piece for his museum. He reached out to Nemezor Zandrek, one of the greatest generals of his age, only to find the old warrior's mind was trapped in the past. Zandrek believed he was still a creature of flesh and blood, fighting the wars of secession. He greeted Zarek's envoys as fellow Necron-tier nobles, then chided his own immortal legions for their poor posture, and ordered them to the mess hall for rations they could not eat. He was a brilliant, senile ghost commanding an army of phantoms in a war that had ended 60 million years ago. The picture became terrifyingly clear. Zarek stood on the bridge of the Song of Oblivion, the reports compiling into a grim mosaic of insanity. His perfect sleeping empire was a myth. He was the king of a galactic madhouse, a nation of ghouls, suicide cultists, obsessive collectors, and senile old lords. The Tyrannid threat was an external crisis, a problem of simple cosmic extermination. But this internal decay, this rotting of the soul he had worked so hard to preserve in metal, was an infinitely more complex and heartbreaking challenge. He had not returned to lead an army. He had returned to cure a plague of the mind and forge a weapon from the shattered, insane remnants of his people. A king cannot rule a madhouse without becoming its chief physician. From his throne on Mandragora, Zarek began the arduous task of binding his shattered empire back together. He knew he could not rule by ancient decree alone. He needed a new foundation. He began by re-establishing the Triarch. He summoned the Phyrons of the most powerful and lucid dynasties to a grand council held via hololith in the reconsecrated High Chamber. But this was not the council of equals he had once led. He stood alone, his authority absolute. The other two seats of the Triarch, he declared, would be filled by his chosen deputies, his lieutenants in the great war to come. Their role was to enact his will, not to debate it. With cold, irrefutable logic, he laid out the grim reality of their situation. He showed them the sensor data of the Tyrannid hive fleets, vast biological locusts poised to strip the galaxy bare. They are the true threat, his synthesized voice echoed in the chamber, devoid of emotion, but heavy with purpose. They will consume the very biomass we require to one day reverse the curse of biotransference. They will render our immortality meaningless by turning our inheritance into a dead husk. I offer you a future. I offer you a purpose beyond mere survival. I offer you the fruits of my 60 million year search, a path back to the flesh, a restoration of the souls we lost. But first you will serve me. You will unite under my banner, and we will cleanse this galaxy of the great devourer. The twin promises victory over an existential threat and a potential cure for their soulless state, were a powerful lure. Many dynasties, awed by his vision and the sheer weight of his historical authority, pledged their allegiance immediately. But not all were so easily swayed. Imhotep the Stormlord, pharaoh of the mighty Sautek dynasty, was the greatest military strategist the Necrons had known since the Great Sleep. He had already carved out a significant empire for himself and saw Zarek not as a savior, but as a rival. He met the Silent King's summons with a challenge, his vast fleets moving into a tense standoff with Sarek's royal armada. Sharek did not engage him in a simple battle. That was the Stormlord's arena. Instead, he challenged the very foundation of Imhotep's pride, his strategic genius. He invited the Stormlord to a private conference, a battle waged not with fleets, but with minds. On a shared tactical display that encompassed the entire galaxy, Zarek ran a simulation. "Show me your plan to defeat the Devourer Lord Imhotep," he commanded. Imhotep, proud and confident, laid out his strategy. A brilliant series of feints, traps, and overwhelming assaults. His simulated fleets won victory after glorious victory against the Tyranids. But as the simulation ran, Zarek highlighted the true cost: attrition. For every world Imhotep saved, he lost irreplaceable Necron legions. The Tyranids could breed endless warriors. The Necrons could not. Imhotep's plan would save the galaxy, but it would leave the Necron race a shadow of its former self, too weak to claim their prize. Then Zarek unveiled his own strategy. It was a plan of breathtaking scale and ruthless pragmatism. It treated the lesser races not as enemies to be purged, but as pawns. The Imperium of Man would be allowed to blunt the hive mind's primary assaults, their countless dead buying time. Orc empires would be manipulated into the Tyranids' path, creating a quagmire of endless, pointless war. All the while, the Necron fleets would engage in surgical strikes, crippling vital synapse ships, and using ancient cosmological weapons to create vast, lifeless fire breaks across the galaxy. It was a strategy born from a 60-million-year perspective. Imhotep watched his pride slowly giving way to awe. He was a master of battles. The Silent King was a master of ages. His own genius, which had seemed so absolute, was now revealed as merely tactical. Before him was a mind that saw the galaxy as a single intricate machine, humbled and defeated on a level far more profound than any battlefield the Stormlord bowed his metallic head. "My mind is yours to command. My legions are yours to lead, Silent King." But where intellect failed, force was the only answer. The Pharaoh of the Altima dynasty, a haughty and nihilistic lord, rejected Zarek's call. He declared the Silent King a relic and his crusade a fool's errand. The response was not a negotiation or a second warning. It was an execution. Zarek's royal fleet fell upon the Altima throne world. It was a terrifying display of power. He did not engage their fleets directly. He deployed a celestial orrery, a device that could manipulate the very laws of physics. The system's star was forced to eject a colossal spear of plasma, incinerating the defending ships in a single, silent blast. His forces bypassed the planetary shields with phase technology the other dynasties had long forgotten. Zarek's triarchal Praetorians, his personal guard, teleported directly into the defiant Pharaoh's throne room. As the Lord rose to fight, he was frozen in place, his will overridden by the king's authority. A herald of the king spoke its voice, carrying the monarch's final sentence. "The empire must be whole. Those who stand against unity will be rendered down to serve as its foundation." The pharaoh and his entire court were disintegrated, their living metal harvested, and their dynasty's legions and worlds absorbed directly into the Sarachan fold. A stark message echoed across the Necron network: you will kneel or you will be broken. The reluctant unification had begun. Unification through conquest and persuasion was only the first step. Zarek knew that the loyalty of the insane and the ambitious could not be trusted. To truly rebuild his throne, he needed to forge new instruments of power tools suited for an empire of broken minds. His authority was now personified, by the ever-present figures of his triarchal Praetorians. They were not members of his own dynasty, nor were they drawn from the legions of his new vassals. They were an ancient order awakened from secret crypts known only to him, their loyalty hardwired not to a Pharaon or a world, but to the abstract concept of the Triarch and the supreme authority of the Silent King. Taller than other Necrons, their forms were a perfect fusion of regal ornamentation and martial strength. They flanked his throne on the Song of Oblivion, or stood as silent sentinels in his audience chambers, their hands resting on the hilts of their rods of covenant. They were his heralds, his executioners, and his incorruptible judges. Their silent, unwavering presence was a constant reminder to every overlord in the Empire that the king's will was not a request, but a fundamental law of reality. But where symbolic power was not enough, Zarek employed a far more direct method of control. During a grand review of the legions of a newly subjugated dynasty, its overlord stood beside the Silent King, professing his undying fealty. Zarek listened, his head slightly inclined, before subtly activating a command nexus built into his throne. A low-frequency wave of energy, invisible and silent, washed over the assembled phalanxes. Instantly, 10,000 Necron warriors who had been standing at ease snapped into a state of perfect, synchronized attention. Their heads bowed as one. A green light flickered in their optics as their individual command protocols were momentarily slaved to a new master. This was the obeisance phalanx. It was Zarek's ultimate guarantee of loyalty, a technological leash he held over every single warrior sworn to his cause. During his long exile, he had perfected the means to override the command codes of any Necron, no matter their dynasty. He allowed the Pharaons to keep their armies, their titles, their pride. But he alone held the master switch. At any moment he could seize direct control of their legions, turning their own warriors against them. Their free will was a privilege he granted, and one he could revoke in a nanosecond. With the loyalty of his Praetorians ensuring his personal safety, and the obeisance phalanx ensuring the compliance of his armies, the Silent King's throne was finally secure. He had taken the fractured, insane, and rebellious remnants of his empire and bound them together with promises, threats, and a web of absolute technological control. His weapon was forged. Now he could finally begin to use it. With his empire hesitantly united behind him, Zarek convened his new Triarch to unveil the first grand movement of his cosmic gambit. He was not interested in border skirmishes or reclaiming lost territories. His ambition was, as it had always been on a cosmological scale, he intended to re-engineer a fundamental law of the galaxy itself. On the grand holographic display before his council, he projected a map of the galaxy not marked with territories, but with the locations of dozens of dormant colossal structures. They were Cyclopean space stations of black star-eating stone, adrift in the void for 60 million years. The lesser races had encountered a few, calling them black stone fortresses. Zarek knew them by their true name, talismans of Vaal, the most powerful weapons of the war in heaven. This material, Noctilith Zarek's voice announced, has a unique relationship with the Empyrean. It can be attuned to suppress its chaotic energies to create a zone of absolute psychic nullification. The galaxy is sick. The warp is a cancer that fuels our enemies and makes true order impossible. We will excise the tumor. His commands were absolute. Necron fleets were dispatched across the galaxy on a great harvest. It was a feat of cosmological engineering unseen since their empire first fell. Cryptex and their legions boarded the silent fortresses, their ancient engines humming to life for the first time in an age. One fortress was carefully disentangled from the gravity well of a gas giant. Another was violently purged of a warband of iron warriors who had been trying in vain to unlock its secrets for 1,000 years. Slowly, painstakingly, the great black stations were moved across the stars into a pre-calculated galaxy-spanning array. As the final fortress was locked into position, Zarek gave the order to activate the network. From each pylon of blackstone, a wave of invisible, silent energy began to radiate outwards. The pylons linked their null fields, overlapping and reinforcing each other, creating a vast, lattice-like cage of psychic silence across hundreds of star systems. The Pariah Nexus was born. The effect on the galaxy's living inhabitants was immediate and catastrophic. In the warp, an Imperial cruiser's journey became a nightmare. The light of the Astronomicon vanished, replaced by a crushing, soul-blinding darkness. Their navigator screamed, his third eye bleeding black fluid, as the ship was violently torn from the immaterium and thrown into the silent void. On the shrine world of Ifrenia-Sixk, a choir of astropaths clutched their heads and collapsed, their connection to the great ocean severed, leaving them as little more than drooling, empty-eyed husks. On the worlds within the Nexus, a creeping lethargy began to take hold. A space marine librarian, a master of psychic power, reached for his formidable mental energies and found only a profound emptiness, a soul weariness that left him barely able to lift his bolter. The fervent faith of the Imperial citizens began to curdle into apathy. Their passions, their ambitions, their hopes and fears, the very emotions that defined them, were slowly and systematically smoothed away. Their souls were being smothered under a blanket of perfect, ordered silence. They became listless, docile, and obedient. They became perfect slaves. In the Triarch chamber, Imhotep, the Stormlord, watched the data streams of Imperial collapse with grim satisfaction. "A masterful stroke, Silent King," he stated. "You have broken their greatest weapon. The Psyker, the Demon, the Warp Witch, they are all rendered impotent before us." Sharek dismissed the praise with a subtle gesture. "That is merely a secondary benefit, Stormlord. A useful side effect. You mistake a scalpel for a club." He adjusted the holographic display. It now showed the biosignatures of the pacified human populations within the Nexus. Their brain activity calmed, their psychic resonance flattened to zero. The chaotic energies of the living and the warp are unpredictable variables. They are contaminants in a delicate experiment. We cannot hope to unravel the mysteries of the soul and reverse the biotransference in a galaxy screaming with psychic noise and emotional entropy. The chilling finality of his plan settled upon the Council. "The Pariah Nexus is not a weapon of conquest," the Silent King declared. "It is a laboratory. It is a sterile field. By silencing this region of space, we create the perfect controlled environment. By pacifying its inhabitants, we secure a limitless supply of biological specimens for study. This is the first step. We are not conquering the galaxy. We are calming it, preparing it for the great work that is to come." The other Phyrans stared, finally understanding. This was not a war for territory. It was a war for the soul of their species, and the entire human race was about to become an unwilling sacrifice on the altar of their salvation. The Pariah Nexus was expanding, a growing zone of silent, ordered reality. But the galaxy's chaos was not so easily tamed. From the void below the galactic plane, a new tendril of the Tyrannid Hive fleet Leviathan lunged upwards, a biological dagger aimed at the heart of the galaxy. Its path was one of total consumption, and its trajectory led it directly towards a cluster of dormant Necron tomb worlds, and fatefully the Baal system, the homeworld of the Imperium's Blood Angels chapter of Space Marines. On the bridge of the Song of Oblivion, Sharek ran the simulations. His unified Necron fleets possessed the power to meet this new threat head-on. They could intercept and annihilate this tendril of the Hive fleet. The simulations confirmed victory was not just possible but probable. However, they also revealed the cost. The premature awakening of 3 major dynasties, the loss of 17 tomb ships and their irreplaceable legions, a delay to his great work of at least 5,000 years. The price was unacceptable. His quest for his people's salvation was paramount. A direct confrontation was inefficient. He required a more elegant, more practical solution. Meanwhile, on Baal, all hope was lost. The Blood Angels, noble sons of Sanguinius, were besieged and on the verge of annihilation. Trillions of tyrannid organisms swarmed their worlds. For all their superhuman skill and righteous fury, they were being drowned under a tide of chitin and claws. Their chapter, after 10,000 years of glorious service, was facing its final bloody end. Then the silent stars began to move. A Necron fleet vast and shimmering with emerald light translated from non-space at the edge of the system. But they did not fire upon the beleaguered Imperial forces. Instead, their weapons unleashed silent lances of energy that vaporized tyrannid hive ships and surgically excised the critical synapse creatures from the swarm. A single colossal vessel, a Cairn-class tomb ship, detached from the main fleet and moved into a high orbit over Baal itself. It broadcast a single repeating message, not in the cryptic machine language of the Necrons, but in flawless archaic High Gothic. On the command deck of his orbiting fortress monastery, Chapter Master Dante, the oldest living space marine in the Imperium, watched the impossible unfold. A holographic projector on his bridge flickered to life, showing not the silent king himself, but one of his triarchal praetorians, its form regal and terrible. "I speak for Zarek, the Silent King." The herald's synthesized voice announced, devoid of negotiation or courtesy. "The Great Devourer is an enemy to all. Our strategic objectives are for this moment aligned. We propose a temporary tactical alliance. Our fleets will fight alongside yours until every last bioform of the Devourer is purged from this system. When the threat is neutralized, this pact is concluded, and our races will return to their natural state of animosity. Accept, and your lineage may endure this day. Refuse, and we shall withdraw and observe your consumption, after which we will sterilize the victors. The choice is yours." Dante, his ancient face a mask of weary disbelief, was faced with the ultimate heresy to ally with the soulless Xenos, the ancient enemy. But the alternative was the certain extinction of his entire chapter. He looked at the battle raging below, at his marines being torn apart. Pragmatism, the cold, hard logic of survival, won out over 10 millennia of ingrained hatred. "We accept," Dante replied. For the first time, the red armor of the Blood Angels stood shoulder to shoulder with the living metal of the Necron Lich Guard, fighting as one against the chittering organic tide. The alliance was a subject of intense debate among Sarek's own court. "You would expend our forces to save these humans," one of his Phyrons demanded. "These fleeting, superstitious creatures." Sharek observed the Battle of Baal on his master display, his gaze analytical and cold. "Do not mistake pragmatism for charity," he responded. "The Imperium is not our ally. It is a tool. It is a shield of flesh and faith 10,000 worlds wide and trillions of bodies deep. They are fanatical numerous, and their losses are in the grand scheme of the galaxy meaningless." The display zoomed out, showing the wider strategic situation. "Let them be the anvil upon which the tyrannid hammer shatters itself. Let their worlds be the firebreak that slows the Devourer's advance. Every warrior they kill is a warrior my legions do not have to face. Every fleet they sacrifice preserves one of my own for the great work that lies ahead. We are not saving them from extinction. We are merely postponing it because their continued existence serves our purpose. Once this common foe is weakened and the Imperium has been bled white in the process, we will simply sweep both from the board." His mercy was a lie. It was just another calculated move in a game only he was playing, sacrificing a pawn to save his queen. The alliance at Baal was over as quickly as it had begun. The Necron and Imperial forces disengaged their weapons still hot and retreated to their respective sides of the system, a silent mutual suspicion hanging in the void between them. For Zarek, the event was a mere data point, a successful field test of his new pragmatic approach to galactic politics. On his command dais, he turned his attention back to the grand strategic map, where the true conflict was displayed. He explained his philosophy to his assembled court, his voice a cold cascade of logic. The lesser races, the Imperium, the Eldari, the Tau, even the Orcs, were not the true enemy. They are symptoms he declared, gesturing to their scattered territories. They are the chaotic, fleeting fever of a diseased galaxy. Treating the fever is a waste of resources. We must instead excise the two cancers that cause it. His hand motioned to a vast, encroaching stain of crimson data representing the Tyranid hive fleets. This is the Great Devourer. It is the logical endpoint of biology, a singular, mindless hunger that seeks to convert all existence into more of itself. It is the tyranny of the flesh. If it wins, the galaxy will become a single, screaming organism devoid of thought or purpose. Then he indicated the swirling, chaotic vortexes of the warp storms with the eye of terror at their heart. And this is the primordial annihilator. Chaos. It is the logical endpoint of the soul, a cancer of emotion that seeks to dissolve the laws of reality itself. It is the tyranny of the spirit. If it wins, the galaxy will become an unending nightmare of madness and mutation. He regarded them as two absolute existential threats, two forces of cosmic annihilation that could not be reasoned with, subjugated, or ignored. They had to be scoured from existence entirely. The transient races, he continued, are the fuel for this fire. Their flesh feeds the devourer. Their souls feed the annihilator. They are the petri dish in which the galaxy's plagues are allowed to fester. Then, for the first time, he revealed his ultimate vision, the final state of order he intended to impose upon the universe. Our purpose is not to rule over this chaos. It is to end it. His map transformed, showing the galaxy not as it was, but as it would be. The stars themselves were rearranged into a more efficient, logical pattern. The unpredictable maelstrom of the warp was gone, sealed away behind a completed galaxy-wide pariah nexus. The lesser races were simply absent. The worlds they once inhabited were now silent, converted into perfectly ordered tomb complexes, grand energy foundries, or silent data archives. It was a vision of a galaxy made perfect, eternal, and sterile. A galaxy reimagined as a flawless machine. The Tyranids offer a universe of endless, screaming hunger. The Silent King concluded, his voice resonating with the finality of a prophecy. Chaos offers a universe of endless, screaming madness. I will offer the galaxy the one thing it has never known, perfect, eternal silence. We will bring it the peace of the machine. We will give it the order of metal. The true purpose of Zarek's war was not waged on the battlefields of the galaxy, but in the silent, sterile laboratories hidden deep within the heart of the Song of Oblivion. These were his most sacred sanctums places, where his finest cryptex worked to unravel the very mystery that had cursed his people. Here the true fruits of the pariah nexus were studied. Along the walls of the primary laboratory stood rows of shimmering stasis fields. Within each field was a living creature, a specimen captured with great care from the galaxy's myriad races. In one floated a lithe Aeldari Farseer, her face a silent mask of psychic agony as arcane devices monitored the flow of her otherworldly thoughts. In another was a human male, a powerful psyker taken from a backwater world, his shaven head covered in a fine web of neural probes that mapped his crude but potent connection to the warp. Zarek's armies were not just conquering, they were collecting. Orikan the Diviner, the same cryptech who had once warned Zarek against the biotransference, now stood as the master of this laboratory. His ancient skepticism had been replaced by a grim fascination with the king's new purpose. The data is conclusive, my king Orikan reported, his metallic claws gesturing towards the readouts from the Aeldari specimen. The human template is adaptable, but psychically unstable, prone to mutation and the whispers of the great enemy. The other species show similar flaws. But the Eldari, their genetic structure is a masterwork. Their minds are like finely tuned psionic instruments. They are the last flawed echo of the Old One's genius. They are a viable template. It was here in the cold light of his laboratory that Zarek revealed the final shocking piece of his grand design to his most trusted lords. He gestured from the captive aliens to a holographic schematic of a standard Necron warrior. For 60 million years, he began, I searched the void for a method to undo what was done. I believed we could construct new flesh, that we could bioengineer our way back to life. That was the path of pride. The art of creating true, soulful life belongs to the old ones, and they are dust. His glowing green gaze settled on the captive Farseer. We cannot create, but we can transfer. We cannot build a new vessel, but we can occupy one that already exists. The chilling implication hung in the silent room. The great work is not one of conquest, but of cultivation. We will calm the galaxy with the Nexus. We will cull the lesser flawed races. We will find the one species with the most suitable biological and psychic potential. Then we will take them. We will foster their growth across 1,000 worlds, guiding their evolution, purifying their genetic code. And when they have reached the pinnacle of their design, when they have become the perfect organic machine, we will initiate a second biotransference. We will move our consciousness from these metal shells into their living bodies. We will take their flesh, their senses, their souls, and make them our own. This was his ultimate solution. Not to rule the galaxy, but to inherit it in the most intimate way possible. To overwrite an entire species, to seize their evolutionary destiny as the final payment for the Necrons' own stolen future. Later, long after his council had departed to begin their grim work, Zarek stood alone in the laboratory. He gazed upon the face of the sleeping Eldari, her features a perfect, ageless sculpture of organic life. For the first time, the central defining contradiction of his entire existence was laid bare. Was this the ultimate act of redemption? Was this his final desperate attempt to give his people back everything he had taken from them? The warmth of a sun, the taste of air, the sting of tears, the peace of a true death. Was he atoning for his great sin by restoring the souls of the Necron tier, even if it meant taking them from another? Or was this the ultimate final act of tyranny, a genocide so profound it dwarfed his original crime? He would not simply be killing a race. He would be stealing their very forms, wearing their skin as a costume to mask his own failure. In his desperate flight from the curse of the machine, was he about to become the galaxy's greatest parasite? The Silent King stood motionless, a machine burdened by a ghost's regret, a savior with the heart of a monster. He had sacrificed his people's souls for their survival, and now he was prepared to sacrifice another species' survival to get them back. The question which would echo unanswered until the end of time was whether this made him a penitent king or the most patient and terrible devil the galaxy had ever known. Upon the dais of the Song of Oblivion, the galaxy burned once more. But this was a different fire. It was a controlled burn, a methodical and precise series of conflicts and pacifications orchestrated by a single, silent will. The Pariah Nexus expanded like a creeping frost, silencing the screams of the warp. The Tyrannid swarms were blunted, their momentum broken against the expendable walls of human and orc flesh, their paths steered by the invisible hand of a master strategist. The great chaotic garden of the galaxy was being weeded, pruned, and prepared for a new and terrible planting. Sharek the Silent King observed it all his mind, a silent universe of calculation and memory. His long journey was nearing its final terrible stage. He was not a hero returning to save the galaxy from the darkness, nor was he a simple villain seeking conquest for the sake of power. To cast him in such simplistic roles would be to misunderstand the scale of his tragedy. He was a paradox given form, a ghost of regret, haunting the perfect immortal machine he had built to escape it. His 60-million-year penance in the void was not a lie. The remorse he processed for the damnation of his people was a genuine, quantifiable fact. He was a ruler whose love for his subjects was so absolute that he had murdered every last one of them to save them from death. Now driven by that same love, that same unending remorse, he was prepared to commit an atrocity that would make the biotransference seem like a prelude. He was the embodiment of a cosmic truth that a wound of infinite depth cannot be healed with a finite solution. His answer to his immeasurable sin was to balance the scales with an equally immeasurable crime. The solution he offered was not one of life, but of stasis. His plan, if it came to fruition, would not usher in an era of peace and prosperity. It would bring about the great silence he had long envisioned. A galaxy where the chaotic, vibrant, beautiful, and terrible energies of life and the soul were extinguished, replaced by the cold, perfect, and eternal logic of the machine. He would save the galaxy from the fevers of chaos and the hunger of the Tyranids, but his cure was a form of death. The peace he offered was the peace of a perfectly arranged and utterly silent graveyard. And for his own people, the Necrontyr, he promised a false dawn. He would give them back the flesh they craved. He would give them senses hearts that could beat lungs, that could draw breath. He would reverse the curse. But this resurrection was a lie. It was a life stolen from another, a body snatched from a species whose only crime was to possess the biological perfection the Necrontyr had lost. They would awaken from their metal slumber, not as a people reborn, but as a race of cosmic usurpers, their new dawn casting a shadow of absolute extinction over another. They would be the ultimate parasites, wearing the skin of their victims as a hollow mockery of the life they had once bargained away. The story of Zarek ends where it began, with a king making an impossible choice for the sake of his people. He once sacrificed their souls to give them eternity. Now he would sacrifice the future of an entire species to give them back. In his private sanctum, far from the cold light of the star map, the silent king stood before a single glowing image. It was not a weapon or a schematic for a fleet. It was a twisting ethereal double helix, the genetic code of an Aeldari, the blueprint for the perfect vessel. His gleaming metallic finger traced the lines of light, his impassive face reflecting the data. The cold green glow in his optics held no malice, no joy, only the vast, empty, and unbreakable resolve of a being who had stared into the abyss of his own failure for 60 million years and had finally found a way to climb out, no matter the cost to the galaxy he would use as his ladder. Was this rebirth worth the price of total annihilation? Was this redemption or the ultimate damnation? For Zarek, the answer was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was that the silence in his people's minds would one day be replaced by the song of life once more, even if it was a song he had to steal.